The island did not look important at first glance, just a jagged strip of coral and jungle in the western Pacific, baking under an unforgiving sun. But in late 1944, Peleliu was anything but insignificant. It sat like a gatekeeper along the path toward the Philippines, and for the United States, securing it meant protecting General MacArthur's return. For Japan, losing it meant exposing a critical defensive line. So both sides poured men, weapons, and determination into a place that would soon become one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the war. By early November, the fight had already turned into something far more vicious than planners had expected. What was supposed to be a quick operation had dragged on for weeks. The island's surface was deceptive. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of limestone ridges, caves, and tunnels, carved and fortified by Japanese forces who had abandoned traditional beach defenses in favor of a deeply entrenched, invisible network. They were not trying to stop the landing, they were trying to bleed the attackers dry. On November 4, 1944, the battlefield had settled into a deadly rhythm. The initial chaos of invasion was gone, replaced by something quieter, more methodical, and far more dangerous. Every movement could be observed, every sound could give away a position. Marines advancing across open ground found themselves pinned down by unseen enemies firing from hidden apertures in the rock. Artillery pounded suspected positions, but often hit nothing more than empty stone. The enemy was there, but rarely where you thought. The terrain made everything worse. Peleliu's ridges, especially the Umurbrogel mountain complex, created a natural fortress. Sharp coral tore at boots and skin. There was almost no soft ground. Digging in was nearly impossible. The heat was relentless, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was little shade. Water was scarce. Men fought not only the enemy, but exhaustion, dehydration, and the constant strain of knowing that death could come from anywhere at any moment. Weather offered no relief. The air hung heavy and still, carrying sound farther than expected. A single rifle shot could echo across the ridges, revealing a position instantly. Dust kicked up by movement lingered, marking anyone careless enough to expose themselves. Even the act of firing a weapon could betray you, not just through sound, but through the flash and disturbance it created. On Peleliu, survival depended on remaining unseen. The Japanese defenders understood this perfectly. They had adapted their tactics to the terrain with ruthless efficiency. Instead of charging or revealing themselves, they waited. Hidden in caves and bunkers, they watched through narrow slits, often invisible until the moment they fired. Their positions were mutually supporting. If one was attacked, another would open fire from a different angle. It created a web of overlapping danger zones where advancing Marines could be trapped, unable to move forward or back without taking casualties. Conventional assaults struggled under these conditions. Infantry advances were slow and costly. Tanks had difficulty navigating the jagged ground and were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. Flamethrowers and demolition teams were used to clear caves, but each position taken often revealed another behind it. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes at the cost of dozens of lives. The battlefield became a test not just of firepower, but of patience, adaptability, and endurance. Within this environment, snipers began to play a different kind of role. They were not just marksmen, they were hunters in a landscape where visibility was limited and exposure meant death. A single mistake, a glint of light off a scope, a puff of dust, the brief flash of a muzzle could be enough to give away a sniper's location. And once detected, survival chances dropped rapidly. Counter-snipers, machine gun fire, or mortar rounds could be brought down within seconds. Remaining hidden wasn't just an advantage, it was the difference between life and death. This was the battlefield on that November day, a place where traditional tactics were failing, where visibility was limited, and where the unseen held the advantage. It was a fight defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by small, calculated actions. Every shot mattered. Every movement had consequences. And somewhere within this harsh, unforgiving environment, a new approach was about to emerge, not from a laboratory, not from a command directive, but from necessity. Because on Peleliu, survival didn't always belong to the strongest force. It belonged to the one that could adapt the fastest, think the quietest, and remain completely invisible. He hadn't started as a soldier. Long before the uniform, before the rifle issued by the Marine Corps, there was a boy moving quietly through the wooded hills of Appalachia, learning lessons that no formal training could fully replicate. Hunting was not just a pastime there, it was a way of life. It taught patience, discipline, and above all, respect for silence. Every snapped twig, every careless step, every shift of wind direction could mean the difference between success and failure. These were instincts, not techniques, and once learned, they never left you. Thomas Elijah Watson carried those instincts with him when he entered the Marine Corps. Like thousands of others, he was trained to fight, to follow orders, to work as part of a unit. But there was something different about men who had grown up hunting. They understood how to disappear. They knew how to wait, not for minutes, but for hours, even days, without losing focus. They didn't just look at terrain, they read it. Marine Corps sniper training refined these natural abilities into something far more precise. It wasn't just about shooting accurately. In fact, pulling the trigger was often the least important part of the job. What mattered more was observation, camouflage, and movement, or the lack of it. A sniper had to become part of the environment, blending into it so completely that even a careful observer could miss them entirely. Watson learned how to use shadows, how to position himself against irregular backgrounds, how to break up the outline of his body and weapon. He learned how light behaved at different times of day, how heat waves could distort a sight picture, how even the smallest reflection could give away a position. He was taught to think several steps ahead. If he fired from one spot, where would the enemy look? If he needed to move, what path would leave the least trace? But training could only go so far. Real combat had a way of exposing the gaps between theory and reality. And Peleliu was unlike anything most Marines had experienced before. The island didn't just challenge physical endurance, it tested mental limits. The constant threat, the oppressive heat, the uncertainty of where the enemy might be hiding, it wore men down. For a sniper, the pressure was even greater. Operating alone or in a small team, often far forward of friendly lines, there was little margin for error. There were no quick reinforcements, no easy escape routes. If a sniper was detected, the response could be immediate and overwhelming. It required a kind of calm that went beyond courage, a steady control over fear, a willingness to trust your training and instincts even when everything around you suggested danger. Watson adapted quickly. Where others saw chaos, he began to see patterns. The Japanese defenders, though hidden, were not random. They moved within their systems of tunnels and firing positions. They exposed themselves briefly, often at predictable moments, when scanning terrain, when coordinating, when engaging advancing troops. These small windows of visibility were all a sniper needed. But identifying a target was only half the challenge. The real difficulty was taking the shot without revealing your own position. On Peleliu, that was harder than it sounded. The dry, rocky ground would kick up dust with the shock wave of a rifle shot. The bright flash at the muzzle could be seen from a distance, especially in the dim light of early morning or late afternoon. Even the sound itself, echoing across the ridges, could point enemies in the right direction. Watson began to understand that survival and effectiveness depended on solving this problem. It wasn't enough to shoot accurately. He had to shoot invisibly. This kind of thinking set him apart. Many soldiers focused on immediate tasks: advance, fire, take cover. Watson was thinking about the enemy's perspective. What would they see? What would they hear? How would they react? If he could control those factors, he could control the engagement itself. There was also the matter of patience, true patience, not just waiting, but waiting with purpose. Hours could pass without a single shot. Muscles would cramp, sweat would sting the eyes, insects would crawl across exposed skin. The urge to move, to adjust, to do something, anything, could become overwhelming. But a sniper who gave in to that urge risked everything. Watson didn't move. He watched. He listened. He learned the rhythm of the battlefield, the pauses between bursts of gunfire, the subtle shifts in enemy behavior, the moments when attention drifted just enough to create an opportunity. In those moments, action had to be immediate, precise, and final. Fellow Marines may not have fully understood what snipers did out there. From a distance, it looked like stillness, like inaction. But that stillness concealed an intense level of focus. Every sense was engaged. Every detail mattered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Watson began to shape his own approach to the fight, not through orders, but through observation and necessity. He was becoming something more than just a trained marksman. He was becoming a problem solver in an environment where the problems were constantly changing. By the time November 4th arrived, Watson was no longer just another Marine adapting to Peleliu. He had absorbed the lessons of the island, internalized its dangers, and started to think beyond conventional methods. The battlefield had forced him to evolve. And soon, that evolution would lead to an idea, simple, almost ordinary at first glance, that would change everything about how he operated in that unforgiving landscape. By the time the fighting settled into its slow, grinding rhythm, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Every shot came with a cost, not just for the enemy, but for the man behind the rifle. On Peleliu, pulling the trigger was an act that could expose you as much as it eliminated a target. The battlefield punished visibility, and even the smallest signature could mean the difference between remaining a ghost and becoming the next casualty. Snipers like Watson were facing a paradox. Their role demanded precision and lethality, but the very act of firing risked giving away their position. It wasn't just the sound. Sound could be confusing, distorted by the jagged ridges and echoing terrain. The real danger came from what could be seen: a brief flash at the muzzle, a faint puff of dust kicked up by the blast, a slight disturbance in the still air. These were enough for a trained observer to pinpoint a general location, and on a battlefield like Peleliu, general was often close enough. Watson had already seen what happened when a position was compromised. Machine guns would open up, probing the area. Mortars might follow, walking their fire across likely hiding spots. Even if they didn't score a direct hit, they forced movement, and movement on that island was deadly. So the problem became clear. How do you fire without being seen? It wasn't a question answered in manuals or training exercises. It was something the environment demanded. Watson began to study not just the enemy, but his own weapon. The rifle was reliable, accurate, but it wasn't invisible. Every time it fired, it announced itself in subtle ways. The muzzle blast displaced air and dust. The heat and combustion created a flash, especially noticeable in low light. Even the barrel itself, exposed and distinct, could catch the eye against the natural background. The solution didn't come as a sudden revelation. It built slowly, piece by piece, through observation and necessity. Watson had seen how small changes in the environment could alter visibility, how a bit of foliage could break up a silhouette, how shadows could conceal movement. If the body could be camouflaged, why not the weapon? At some point, his attention turned to something simple, almost insignificant, a piece of cloth, a wool sock. It wasn't designed for combat, it wasn't issued as equipment for concealment, but in the conditions of Peleliu, where supplies were limited and improvisation was constant, ordinary objects often took on new purposes. The idea was straightforward, but its implications were profound. By placing the sock over the barrel of the rifle, Watson could potentially disrupt the visual signature of a shot. The fabric would break up the clean, recognizable outline of the barrel. It could help diffuse the flash, softening the brief burst of light that might otherwise catch an enemy's eye. It might even reduce the disturbance of dust at the muzzle by altering how the blast interacted with the ground. Of course, there were risks. Any modification to a weapon could affect its performance. Accuracy might suffer. The barrel could overheat. The material could interfere with the bullet's path if not positioned correctly. This wasn't a controlled experiment. It was a decision made in a live combat environment, where failure had immediate consequences. Watson tested it carefully. Small adjustments, subtle changes. He would observe the effects, refine the placement, and adapt. The sock wasn't tightly wrapped. It needed to allow the bullet to pass cleanly while still serving its purpose. It had to be secure enough not to shift, but loose enough to avoid interference. What he discovered was not perfection, but improvement. The muzzle flash became less distinct. The dust signature was reduced. The rifle no longer stood out as sharply against the terrain. It didn't make him completely invisible, but it made him harder to detect. And on Peleliu, harder to detect was often enough. This was the essence of battlefield innovation. Not a dramatic invention, not a piece of advanced technology, but a small, practical adjustment that addressed a specific problem. It didn't require approval or formal adoption. It simply worked. More importantly, it changed the way Watson could operate. Each shot carried less risk of exposure. Each engagement could be prolonged. He no longer had to relocate as quickly after firing, which meant he could maintain a consistent vantage point, observe longer, and act with greater control. It also shifted the psychological balance. The Japanese defenders were accustomed to reacting to threats they could identify. A muzzle flash, a sound, a visible position, these were things they could respond to. But when those cues were reduced or eliminated, uncertainty began to grow. A soldier struck down without warning, without a clear source, created confusion. Was the shooter far away? Hidden nearby? Was there more than one? Uncertainty slowed reactions. It made coordinated responses more difficult. It forced defenders to become cautious, even hesitant. And in a battle defined by tight, concealed positions, hesitation could be just as damaging as direct fire. Watson wasn't thinking in terms of doctrine or long-term impact. He was solving an immediate problem, increasing his own chances of survival while enhancing his effectiveness. But in doing so, he was tapping into a deeper principle. Control what the enemy perceives, and you control how they respond. The wool sock, ordinary and unremarkable, became part of that control. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it did not make him invincible, but it tilted the balance, even if only slightly, in his favor. And on a battlefield like Peleliu, a slight advantage could be everything. What began as a simple act of improvisation was about to prove its value in the most demanding way possible. Because the true test of any idea is not how it works in theory, but how it performs when every shot matters, when every second counts, and the cost of failure is immediate and final.
The day began like many others on Peleliu, hot, tense, and deceptively quiet. There was no dramatic signal that something extraordinary was about to happen, no sudden shift in the battle lines, just the same oppressive heat, the same jagged ridges, and the same invisible enemy waiting for any sign of movement. Watson was already in position. He had chosen his spot carefully, not for comfort, but for advantage. It offered a narrow field of view over terrain the Japanese were known to use, an area where movement, though limited, was inevitable. It wasn't a place you could simply walk away from. Once settled, movement had to be minimized, sometimes eliminated entirely. Every inch mattered. Every angle was calculated. He lay still, blending into the environment, his body aligned with the ground, his rifle positioned with deliberate precision. The sock, now part of his setup, covered the barrel. It didn't look like much. Nothing about it suggested significance, but in that moment it was the difference between being seen and remaining invisible. Time passed slowly. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The battlefield around him echoed with distant gunfire, occasional bursts of machine guns, the low rumble of artillery in the background. But in his immediate area, there was stillness, the kind of stillness that demanded patience. Then, movement. A figure appeared briefly, just enough, a head, a shoulder, the outline of a soldier shifting within a concealed position. For most, it would have been too quick, too uncertain, but for Watson, it was all he needed. He didn't rush. The rifle steadied, breath controlled, finger tightening with deliberate pressure. The shot broke cleanly. And then, nothing. No return fire, no immediate reaction. The battlefield absorbed the sound, softened by distance and terrain. There was no obvious flash to give him away, no clear marker pointing back to his position. The figure disappeared, but not in retreat. Watson remained still. He did not adjust his position, didn't scan wildly for confirmation. He trusted the shot. More importantly, he trusted that he had not been seen. Time passed again. Another movement, another opportunity, this time from a slightly different angle, but within the same general area. The Japanese defenders were still operating, still unaware that something had changed. To them, nothing was obvious, no visible threat, no clear direction of danger. Again, Watson fired. Again, silence followed. This pattern continued, not in rapid succession, but in careful intervals. Each shot was separated by time, enough time to avoid drawing attention, enough time to let the battlefield settle back into its natural rhythm. He wasn't trying to overwhelm, he was trying to remain invisible. Target by target, the count increased. Each engagement followed the same disciplined process: observe, wait, confirm, fire, then return to stillness. No unnecessary movement, no repeated shots at the same moment, no pattern that could be easily recognized. From the perspective of the Japanese forces, something was wrong, but not clearly defined. Men were being hit, one by one, without warning. There was no obvious sniper position, no muzzle flash to trace, no sound that clearly indicated direction. The terrain already made visibility difficult, and now even the subtle cues they relied on were gone. Confusion began to set in. Some may have suspected a distant shooter. Others might have thought the threat was closer, hidden within the same ridgelines. Without a clear source, responding effectively became almost impossible. Firing blindly into the terrain risked exposing their own positions. Moving hastily could make them targets. Hesitation spread, and Watson remained where he was. He did not relocate. That was one of the most remarkable aspects of the operation. On a battlefield where snipers often had to move after a single shot, he held his ground. The effectiveness of his concealment and the reduction of his firing signature allowed him to maintain the same position for an extended period. But holding position came with its own challenges. The body begins to resist stillness, muscles tighten, fatigue builds. The urge to shift even slightly becomes almost overwhelming, yet every instinct to move had to be suppressed, because even the smallest adjustment could break the illusion. So he endured. Shot by shot, the number grew, not rapidly, not recklessly, but steadily. Each one the result of patience, control, and precise timing. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary risk. At some point, the scale of what was happening became clear, at least from his perspective.
This was no longer a matter of isolated engagements. It had become a sustained operation, carried out by a single individual who remained undetected. By the end of the day, the count stood at 29. 29 confirmed targets, eliminated without drawing a single round of return fire. 29 engagements conducted from the same position without compromise. It wasn't just the number that mattered, it was how it happened. No dramatic firefight, no visible confrontation, just silence, precision, and control. The battlefield had been shaped not by overwhelming force, but by absence, by the inability of the enemy to see, to locate, to respond. And when it was over, Watson did what he had done all along. He remained unseen, because on Peleliu, survival didn't go to the loudest or the fastest. It went to the one who could operate without being noticed at all.
When the shooting stopped, nothing about the landscape immediately revealed what had just happened. There was no dramatic shift in terrain, no visible marker of a decisive breakthrough. Peleliu remained what it had always been, harsh, silent, and unforgiving. But beneath that silence, something had changed. The effect was not measured only in numbers, though 29 confirmed kills in a single day was extraordinary by any standard. The deeper impact was psychological. Japanese forces operating in that sector were no longer facing a visible threat they could study, locate, and counter. Instead, they were confronted with something far more unsettling, an enemy presence they could not detect. Positions that once felt secure became uncertain. Every exposed movement carried new risk. Even the act of observing the battlefield, lifting one's head for a brief moment, could be fatal. Without a clear understanding of where the danger was coming from, decision-making slowed. Coordination became more difficult. Confidence eroded. This kind of disruption could not be easily countered with artillery or maneuver. You can bombard a known position, you can flank a visible enemy, but how do you fight something you cannot see? For the Marines advancing through that area, the effect worked in the opposite direction. Pressure eased, even if only slightly. Fewer incoming shots, less accurate fire from defensive positions. Small openings began to appear, moments where movement became possible, where ground could be gained with reduced risk. It didn't end the battle. Peleliu remained a brutal, grinding fight, but it shifted the balance, if only in a localized way. And in a campaign where progress was measured in yards and paid for in lives, even a small shift mattered. What Watson had done was not part of a formal plan. There had been no directive ordering innovation, no issued equipment designed for that specific purpose. It was a solution born entirely out of necessity, an individual response to a specific problem in a specific environment. And yet, that is often how change begins in warfare. After the battle, stories like this didn't immediately become doctrine. The military does not transform overnight based on a single event. It observes, it evaluates, it compares. What worked? Why did it work? Can it be repeated under different conditions? The idea of reducing a sniper's visual signature was not new, but what Watson demonstrated was how even the simplest materials could be used to achieve it. The principle was clear: control what the enemy can perceive. Minimize every indicator: light, movement, sound, disturbance. Become not just hidden, but effectively invisible. Over time, these lessons would echo beyond Peleliu. Sniper training would continue to evolve, placing even greater emphasis on concealment, on environmental awareness, on understanding how every action creates a signature that can be detected. Equipment would improve, techniques would become more refined, but the underlying concept remained the same. It wasn't about the sock itself. It was about the mindset behind it. The willingness to adapt, to question whether the current method is the best one, to look at a problem from the enemy's perspective and find a way to disrupt their ability to respond.
That kind of thinking cannot be issued as standard equipment. It has to be developed, often under pressure, often in moments where the cost of failure is immediate. There is also a tendency over time for stories like this to grow, to take on their own life. Details can become exaggerated, simplified, or misunderstood. It's important to separate the core truth from the surrounding narrative. What remains consistent, however, is the reality of the environment in which it occurred. Peleliu was a place that demanded adaptation. It punished rigidity and rewarded those who could think differently. Whether every detail is recorded perfectly or not, the lesson endures. Innovation in war is rarely about complexity. It is often about clarity, seeing a problem for what it truly is, stripping it down to its essentials, and finding a solution that works within the constraints of the moment. Watson's actions reflected that clarity. He did not rely on overwhelming firepower. He did not depend on advanced technology. He used what he had, understood the environment, and adjusted his approach in a way that increased both his effectiveness and his chances of survival. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that extends far beyond a single battlefield. That sometimes the greatest advantage is not strength or speed or even accuracy. It is the ability to remain unseen. Because in a world where every movement can be tracked, every signal can be detected, and every position can be targeted, invisibility becomes power.